Welcome to the top 12 highlights from Chapter 12. As we look at the federal bureaucracy, these are the highlights. So what we're going to do is just hit the top 12 highlights from this chapter. If you want more depth, you want to go into details of some of the things you see here, definitely go back and look at the overview videos. There's 2 overview videos covering the bureaucracy, checks and constraints on the bureaucracy. That goes into a lot more depth. Here we're just hitting the highlights to give you a flavor for what this chapter was all about, kind of refresh or jog your memory, and I hope you find this helpful. So let's start with number 12. What is the bureaucracy? Well, it is made up of different agencies, people who are doing the work of the American government. The idea of a bureau is a French word for desk. Cracy, the opportunity to rule. Democracy, rule of the people or by the people. Bureaucracy, ruling from the desk. So this idea of ruling from the desk is what we see here. And the bureaucracy made up of different agencies and departments that are carrying out the people's work. That all of the laws that were bills in Congress and passed by the president, signed into law after Congress, and then the bureaucracy gets them to enforce them, to carry them out. So they do that through agencies, departments, cabinet members, regulatory commissions, and government corporations. These are civil servants. They are career employees. They have a career path. Many of them have degrees in their specialized fields, whether it is law or whether it is accounting or whether it is other financial aspects or communications or whatever the case may be. They are specialized in their particular industries. And so there is definite career path for them in this capacity. Now, the bureaucracy is made up of, again, trained professionals. If you walked into the office, you'd see something to the effect of a hierarchy. You'd see a typical office building, people who are managers of people, and the like, just like you would in an office building. But the idea is they're carrying out the people's business, and their tasks are very specialized. They are carrying out specific roles, and again, very highly trained. If they're moving up in the GS rating of the Federal Civil Service System, they are, especially if they're SES, the Senior Executive Service, they're very highly trained individuals, very specialized in the field that they're in, and they have seen many years of service and are very experienced to be able to answer some of the tough questions that they may get over time as they work in this particular agency or department or whatever the case may be. Now, we know that this org chart kind of funnels up through the executive branch. So the bureaucracy is a function of the executive branch. They are the ones that enforce or carry out the laws, and it is the executive branch that would handle the bureaucracy in this capacity. We see all of that funneling up to the president that determines the policy agenda, the priorities of the administration, and the bureaucracy would help them to carry that out. The bureaucracy made up primarily the 4.5 million people. We'll talk about that in a second. But primarily they are civil service. They are not patronage jobs. Only about 5,000 of those are patronage jobs appointed by the president. All of the others are civil service employees that are permanent in the government. They don't go away when administrations change. And that's what we see in the overall bureaucracy. Now, moving to number 11, what do bureaucracies do? Well, a couple of things. We mentioned that they carry out the laws, or they're the enforcers, they're the implementers. This is very much what we see when Congress passes a bill and makes it to the president's desk, and then the bill becomes a law. They're also, though, taking those laws and turning them into rules, regulations, checklists, or other types of administrative procedures that people will have to follow in their respective areas of work. And so administering that is really important, but also regulating that, enforcing it, and determining based on policies and procedures, do we fine them? Do we give them a warning? Do we close their place of business or place of work because of violating standards? All of this is done through the bureaucracy. It is civil servants that are carrying out this job. And that idea of implementation and the idea of implementation, administration, and enforcement is really the role here, and they need money to do it. So many times Congress may pass something that is either funded or unfunded, but also partially funded. Maybe the resources that they get aren't what they really needed. They needed more resources as a result of this. So all of this plays a role in terms of how they're able to carry out the law or enforce the law. And they would be remiss if we didn't mention that they need state and local governments to help do this. It is not enough to give money from the National Department of Education, money for schools and for education. It's got to be implemented somehow. And when the bureaucracy is looking at this, they're looking at implementing that through things like the Department of Education. And they're using the Maryland State Department of Education in order to do that. And then that funnels down to the local school systems like Montgomery County Public Schools. So without state and local governments, it'd be very hard to implement these laws or regulations that Congress is passing, and the executive branch through executive orders is actually making possible. So when we look at the idea of the growth of state and local government, we wonder, why is that happening? And it's really because of the federal government having to carry out all of the regulations, the standards. How do we give out money? Well, it's not the feds that are giving out that money. They're giving it to states, and the states are working through all of those programs and grant making procedures county by county, and depending on the situation, maybe it's highways. The highways are working throughout the state, throughout the counties, throughout the localities in order to carry that out. So we'll see a lot of growth in state and local government as a result of this in terms of that implementation. They're really reliant on state and local government to help with that. Okay, so that takes us to number 10 then. Let's break down the bureaucracy in terms of where do these different agencies, regulators, and such, how do they fit into this puzzle? We see 4 different types of the bureaucracy here. It starts with the cabinet, these departments. These are departments because they are the creme de la creme of the bureaucracy. First of all, they're some of the biggest agencies that we have here. And again, we really should use the term departments here, not agencies, because agencies are different. They are independent, and departments are not. They're carrying out the president's agenda. And the president's policy agenda or priorities is really important in the cabinet. So what we see here is we have secretaries of these different departments in all of these except for the Department of Justice. That would be the Attorney General. And the secretary of this, or the Attorney General, is carrying out the president's policy agenda. How do we implement what the president wants to do? How do we prioritize what the agency or the department here in this case is doing in order to make sure that we're following with what the president wants done? And carrying that out is really important for the secretary to do, and the political appointees at the top of each department to help with that in that regard. So if it is Department of, it is a cabinet level position. The heads of these agencies, these departments that are approved, that are appointed by the president, would have to be approved by the Senate. That is an advice and consent role. And many of the some of the sub and undersecretary type of positions also would face that type of scrutiny by the Senate. Some of them don't. Again, State Department, for example, there's a few hundred there that are political appointees, and the rest of the 75,000 people working in the State Department would actually be under civil service. Now let's move to the independent executive agencies. They're independent for a reason, and that's because they kind of do their own thing. Now, they do keep in mind, and they will incorporate or implement the president's agenda in terms of their priorities. It definitely changes their priorities. But what they do day to day pretty much is the same stuff they did day to day under another administration, barring any significant changes in priority levels. And so what we see them do is what their policies and procedures for their agencies tell them to do. And we see this over and over again. Again, the people who head up these agencies are appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. But the idea here is that they are doing independent work. And so the National Archives, what it does is very different than what NASA does, which is very different from what the National Science Foundation does. And they kind of stick with, and again, very specialized, they're sticking with what they do, and they're very, very good at it. Now, if we look at the regulators, these are the only roles that are appointed by the president at the top and approved by the Senate, but also can't be removed by the president for any old reason. There has to be cause because they are regulators, and because they are regulators, they need to take politics out of the equation. So this is where the regulators can't be removed except for cause. And again, we've seen President Trump, for example, has been very upset with the Federal Reserve System chair, the Federal Reserve Board chair, and Jerome Powell, but he hasn't fired him because he can't fire him without cause, and there's been no real cause for him to do so. Just because you disagree with him in terms of tactics or in terms of strategy in what he's doing in that role. So Jay Powell is still in that office and continues to be, even though he may not agree in tweets with what the president tweets out. But that is significant there for regulators. So regulators, again, according to procedures, when they carry out the law, they can issue fines. They can issue cease and desist orders, basically stop doing this, or we're going to fine you, shut you down. They can even file penalties against executives of companies or organizations that are violating the law. And so they have the full force of the American government behind them in taking these things to court in order to get these judgments and that sort of thing. And we've seen Martha Stewart was the example I used in the overview video of the situation with the Securities and Exchange Commission, where she traded insider information, was found guilty of having done so, and went and served time in jail for doing that. That is the job of a regulator. They carry out the law by making sure that people, by enforcing it, by making sure that people are complying with the law. And if they don't, they take action against them. And that's exactly what the regulator, the SEC, did in that particular case. And they do this every day, all day, in their jobs as regulators. And again, very specialized roles in the civil service. The last one is government corporations, and these are the companies that are owned by the U.S. government, but do charge for their services. So the fees that they're charging don't cover all of the costs of maintaining these organizations. So the government does help in subsidizing their roles, such as taking a train ride from here to New York City on Amtrak, or mailing a letter or a package, or even getting electricity in the Appalachian Mountains through the Tennessee Valley Authority. All of these owned by the federal government, but they are corporations in that they are charging for their services in addition to what the government is subsidizing. So these are the different components of the federal bureaucracy, be it departments, agencies, regulators, or corporations that make up the U.S. federal bureaucracy that we see today. Now, in terms of regulation, we kind of talked about this. They administer the law in terms of carrying it out. How do we implement those laws? They come up with the rules, and that is significant here. But they also then take it to the level of getting judgments against people and really using the full force of the law to force people to comply with the law, to make sure that they are following the law to protect Americans. I mean, safety is the number one factor in terms of what they do. And so we see safety time again coming up, whether it's the EPA or whether it is the SEC or the FEC, or excuse me, the FEC or the FCC. All of these are all about protecting Americans' lives and livelihoods, and in so doing, making sure that people are complying with the law in doing so. How does this affect us in real life? Well, every day, from the time you turn off the alarm clock or hit the snooze button, it is a part of regulation that keeps us alive. When we hit the snooze button, it doesn't electrocute us. That is because of government regulation that keeps companies from faulty manufacturing of materials, and making sure those products through the Consumer Product Safety Commission are taken off the market. That's a good example of making sure that regulation is working for the American people. So we see this time and time again, but it really comes back to safety and protection, protecting Americans, and they do this every day. throughout everything that they're doing for us. And that moves us to number 9, which is how does this implementation actually take place in this idea of policy making? Implementation is really important here. And a lot of times Congress passes a law, but they don't give a lot of details around it. So it really is up to the bureaucracy to kind of read between the lines and kind of make some assumptions about what is happening in order to come up with rules based on their procedures, based on what they know about the law, based on what they know of history of the organization that they're in, the agency or the department or the regulator, and then coming up with this idea of discretionary authority. How do we take action based on what we know that we can do, based on our policies and procedures manual, based on training, when we train civil service employees when they first come on, and training throughout their career paths in the bureaucracy, they are given more and more discretionary authority. And a good example, I know Ms. Meal and I always use the TSA. It is through training and policies and procedures that those who work for the TSA at airports decide at a moment's notice, something is in a piece of luggage. What do I do in this situation? Do I flag it? Do I seize the luggage? Do I call in someone to take a closer look? Do we do a scan and make the person go back through the metal detector? Do we escalate this to a bigger matter? Maybe it involves an arrest or it involves sequestering someone for questioning. All of these decisions are made in split seconds based on training, based on procedures that they have had to follow and the training they have had in order to help them make those decisions so that they don't have to waste time calling higher ups, calling managers and administrators for mundane questions that are pretty standard run-of-the-mill questions that they get several times throughout the day or even throughout the week. So that is really the discretionary authority in terms of making those decisions. And then they have administrative discretion to determine how they're implementing that. So based on the situation, based on their training, how do we approach the person? How do we address the issue? How can we do this to de-escalate the matter and make sure that we're following the law, but also protecting the safety of everyone that's around them, that's around these individuals at the time. So that really is lending itself to this idea of administrative discretion in terms of the how and how we carry that out. And Congress didn't give them a playbook for that. Even the agency themselves doesn't give them a play-by-play for every unique situation they're going to come into contact with. But what they do give them is a standard operating procedures in terms of how you deal with different types of things. And hopefully you can piece together based on that what you would do in a particular situation or what you would do in a particular scenario in order to be able to address it. And that really is the point of why they are so specialized and why they are trained to do their jobs and do it well. So that's really the role that we see here. And that takes us to number 8, which is, well, where do they get all this training from? How do they see this going forward? And it really is the creme de la creme of the agency or department that is the SES. These are those at the top, and not the political appointees at the very top, but those at the top of the civil service for each of these departments or agencies. The SES is the top of the civil service, of the merit system. These are the people that have been there the longest. These are the people that have moved up ranks. They've been promoted. They have sought additional training and responsibility and managerial level types of roles and essentially been accepted into those types of programs and inducted in so doing. Now, it does get a lot of bad reputation in the public's eye. We do see from time to time the SES, very specialized, very professional, and knowing in establishing these policies and procedures, knowing what to do and being able to train others to do the same within their agencies. That is really critical here. But in many cases, what we see is they get a bad rap, right? Obama hired us, Trump can't fire us. Oh, Obama's army found. This is kind of the drain the swamp mentality. So we see the bureaucracy, and especially the SES, getting a bad rap from both sides in terms of what's happening here, in terms of what's going on. And the SES members, as you can see, the states with the most outside of D.C. would be states like California, Texas, Georgia, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and we see the idea here is that the SES is this pinnacle of achievement that they can move to. And when they are looking at how to carry out decisions and how to handle the discretionary authority of policies that they're giving to their workers in these agencies and departments, they really are relying on the SES in terms of helping to carry that out. And now fast forward to the policy agenda of the president. The president is reliant on his political appointees, who are then very reliant on members of the SES in terms of how do we go about doing this in the agency? How do we go about carrying this out? What is the best model for us to take in order to move this forward? And the SES is going to help those political appointees in terms of carrying out that agenda within their agency, within their department. And so like with the EPA, how do we determine what decisions to make and what actions to take in these particular agencies? It is really through the SES that they are carrying this out. And that really is a vital part of what we're seeing here. All right, in number 7, we're looking at this idea of how do we control the bureaucracy? What aspects of the federal bureaucracy do we see here? And remember, Congress has some control, and we'll talk more about that in terms of checks on the bureaucracy as well. But the idea here is that the bureaucracy is its own entity within the executive branch. Members of Congress can't hold these jobs, and those that are appointed by the president aren't serving in civil service jobs. There is a fine line between them. They are carrying out the president's agenda and doing what the president would ask, but they are limited in terms of what they can do. And the judicial branch can step in and rule some type of rule or implementation unconstitutional, a violation of the Constitution. There's a lot of members of the branches that can step in from time to time and say, "Whoa, wait a minute, we're looking at this." And Congress, one of the best ways they can do this is calling for hearings. They can call the heads of these agencies before Congress and say, here is something we don't like. Why are you doing this? Why are you carrying this out? Or why is it taking so long? Why haven't you sped this up? Why isn't this fast-tracked and on a faster scale? And a lot of it, again, is because the size and scope of the agencies that are trying to carry this out, or the size and scope of what they're trying to do. Many times, it takes time to get those things done, and usually it takes them longer than they think it's going to take. That always happens as well. Now, in terms of what we see here, if we look at the entirety of the bureaucracy, counting state and local governments and that kind of thing, we would see this in the millions, right? But what we're looking at here is usually about 4.5 million people. That includes postal workers, federal employees in the civil service, and the military. Now, we're not including private contractors, which again would more than double the size of the bureaucracy if you counted private companies, contractors that are working with the federal government or on behalf of the federal government. And then when you look at colleges and universities and other people, and then you look at the state and local governments, yeah, it's just an explosion of who you would include there. But traditionally, that red box is what we normally would look at in the bureaucracy, about 4.5 million people. It includes those 15 departments, 50 agencies, the Postal Service, and like I said, the armed forces. Now, Congress does have oversight here. They do have the ultimate power of the purse. They can cut the budget. They can cut the agency. They can eliminate the agency entirely. You might remember Texas Governor Rick Perry in one of the races for president that he was in. He called for getting rid of 3 agencies. He named 2 and forgot the other one. That was kind of the faux pas that ended his presidential race. But we've heard this a lot from members of Congress trying to get rid of an agency that they think is worthless and not worth anything. And that is one of the powers that the Constitution gives to Congress to be able to do. But they can also call them in and hold hearings and question them. They can increase their budget. They can cut their budget, as I mentioned. They can cut the agency entirely. They can continue to call them in for hearings. They can call in subpoena various members of the SES as well as patronage jobs in terms of trying to get them to focus on issues that Congress cares about, their policy agenda, and trying to get them to focus on those issues by bringing it to light for the members of the media, for the American people. And we see that taking shape as well. Congress can also, if they see that they pass legislation and then they see that the bureaucracy is carrying it out not in a way that they wanted, they can call them in for hearings or pass new legislation that helps to clarify for the bureaucracy. One of the easiest ways to get the bureaucracy to get kind of in line with what you want them to do is to call them in for a hearing and basically question them along the lines of, why didn't you guys do this? We passed X bill and we wanted X to be done, and you're kind of going to, M, Y, and Z. What's going on there? We're kind of missing the boat. And really, that is helpful for the bureaucracy too, because it helps to clarify a lot of the things that they may have been assuming, kind of reading between the lines, that they didn't know they were able to, that Congress wanted them to do. So that's an important role taking place here too. I'm not going to go into all of these in terms of checks on the bureaucracy. We've talked about these in class, and I definitely went over them in the overview. But we can see that the bureaucracy is checked by every branch of government, whether it's the president in terms of being able to appoint those people or issue executive orders that basically tell them what to carry out, as well as Congress, as we said, that has the power of the purse, as well as the judiciary that can rule a law unconstitutional as well as any rules unconstitutional that are being implemented. All of those serve as checks on the bureaucracy. And the president, obviously, in trying to carry out the policy agenda and really being the head of the bureaucracy, if you will, has a lot more authority in being able to get the bureaucracy to do what he wants them to do. So really limiting, and we talked about the EPA website example in getting rid of climate change, is just one way that the president can really carry out the policy agenda by shifting the agency's focus, or the regulators' focus in this case, to what he wants them to focus on, or in this case, what he didn't want them to focus on. So that is a power of the president in being able to do that. And then lastly, contracting is a big one today. We see a lot of things that used to be within the federal bureaucracy that are now carried out by contractors, that we may have a skeletal staff within NASA, but they are working with SpaceX in order to carry that out. Elon Musk's company, the owner of Tesla. And the idea there is that these contractors, maybe they can do it better, smarter, faster, cheaper from an economic perspective, but also from a productivity perspective. So we have a lot of contractors out there today, and we mentioned that in a previous slide, because of the fact that we're trying to take advantage of efficiencies in which we don't necessarily need to hire government workers to do it all. And so we have a smaller civil service that's helping to carry those out and to hold those contractors accountable, but it is outside firms that we can get to do it for a smaller expense, and we pass those savings along to the American people. And that is really where we see a lot of the growth today in those contractors. All right, moving to number 6 then. So who are these bureaucrats we're talking about here? They tend to get a lot of political cartoons made about them, right? We know they're not elected officials, but they do work within the civil service for these agencies and departments and bureaus, the regulators, if you will, and the corporations. There are about 3,000 that are politically appointed, right? So they're above the civil service, but at the head of those departments and agencies. The civil service, or the senior executive service, the SES, at the very top of that civil service would be next. So at the top you have political appointees, beneath them the SES, and then you have all of the civil service beneath them. And we can see here the political appointees. I think the Biden, the president-elect's transition team is looking at about 4,500 of those political appointees across, I think there were about 4,000 that were appointed under the Trump administration. And then notice the SES is about 7,000. In a staff, in a civil service of 4.5 million people, there's about 7,000 that are in the SES themselves. So that is interesting enough in that you have 7,000 managers, if you will, that are managing teams of about 4.5 million people. And that's not even counting the outside contractors, where the numbers are even greater. But these are the bureaucrats that we see. And where do they come from? Well, cabinet departments mainly are where they're working because, again, those are the biggest parts of the bureaucracy. They're larger in terms of number of employees and the amount of money that's being spent by those departments in terms of carrying out the agenda of the president and doing things on behalf of the American people. So we can see HHS is one of the largest. The idea here is 93% of the federal budget is going into the bureaucracy, is going into these these departments and agencies and the military and that sort of thing, in terms of what we see here. About 1.4 million, according to this chart, going into military personnel, 800,000 for the postal workers, and then we've got everybody else working in the civil service. And the SES, again, about 7,000, very small sliver of what we see there, and the political appointees even smaller than that. And that leads us to, so how did we get this civil service in the first place? Looking at number 5, the idea of the merit system came about from 1883, the Pendleton Civil Service Act. Now, there were a lot of things that happened as a result of this, including an assassination, but also a number of things that were happening at the time. And we have seen over the years that administrations come in and they bring all of these people with them. And essentially the bureaucracy has this wholesale change, and it takes time for the new people to get up to speed. Well, there's not a lot of continuity of government there. Think about this in terms of the military. There's not a lot of continuity of government if a new administration is coming in with all new people working in the bureaucracy. And so if it takes them time to get up to speed, you as a country are much more vulnerable. You as a trading partner are much more vulnerable when a new president comes in. We needed more continuity of government in relation to this, and the assassination just promulgated that, among other things. There was also concerns that people were, it was a spoils system, so people were concerned about waste, fraud, abuse, corruption, and so the Pendleton Civil Service Act was designed to create a system in which people would apply and they would take a civil service exam, or they would opt out of that through getting a degree in a particular area of expertise, and they would have a career path. They wouldn't leave with every administration coming and going. They would have a career path, and that would allow them to move through the bureaucratic structure and actually have a career in doing great work for the American people. And this essentially created the merit system, or the civil service system that we have today. It is very specialized. Again, I mentioned we have lawyers that work in probably all of the agencies, departments, and regulators. We have accountants that do the same thing. We have scientists and doctors that are working in many departments, such as NIH and such as the Department of Health and Human Services, and we won't, for sake of time, we won't go into all those details. But the idea here is it created a structure of continuity of government, and it really helped to establish that professional, specialized structure of people, that it created a career path for them, but also created a continuity of government for government services, such as Social Security checks that were being mailed out to people, or programs that were helpful to keep widows of killed service members, help them get their money and keep going and being able to pay their bills. Now, what we see today is it created this kind of tiered effect. So what we have is at the top, we have the patronage jobs. This is the Mike Pompeo, President Trump appointing him as Secretary of State. A few hundred other people being appointed as well. And then we have this SES, the Senior Executive Service, about 7,000 of those across the civil service. And then just within the State Department alone, you have under them in the civil service about 75,000 people that work either at Foggy Bottom or in other consulates, embassies, and other locations for the State Department in this country and around the world. And that really is brought about because of the Pendleton Act, because of this creation of this civil service system that we have today. Now, it hasn't always been a smooth sailing, and there has been some bumpy rides along the way. In 1939, the Hatch Act essentially said, okay, there's a lot of political activity going on. We have people that are members of the civil service that are using their resources in their offices and whatnot for political gain. Maybe they're running for office. Maybe they're helping people run for office. Maybe they're even using resources from the office because those resources aren't readily available to many people in 1939. They can't just go down to Staples or FedEx office and get poster board and make copies and that sort of thing. So they're using their resources. And the idea here, or even the phones, phone lines and that sort of thing at that time, calling from the office, looks like you're calling from your office doing official work, but you're actually doing political work. So the Hatch Act basically put a stop to this and said, okay, if you work for the civil service, you can't you can't just do whatever you want to in the job. You need to be limited in terms of what political activities you take part in. Now, some of this has been relaxed since then, and some of it's not as enforced. But even political appointees are covered under the Hatch Act. So we have seen in recent days Ivanka Trump, Kellyanne Conway, Peter Navarro, people that are members of the White House staff that have been called out for violations of the Hatch Act because in their capacities, in using either their capacities of social media in order to get the president's agenda out, they've also advocated for or against candidates running for office, and that is a violation of the Hatch Act. Now, catch-22, who is going to enforce this? Well, Office of General Counsel will refer this to the president, and the president makes that decision. So you can see here, the president is probably not going to enforce that Hatch Act against his own daughter. And so, to be continued, we'll see how that plays out. But that probably isn't going to lead to much in that capacity. Now, turn that around for a civil service employee. That's very different. A civil service employee, that'll be on your record. So you want to be very careful what you do there as a civil service employee, because whether you're applying for a promotion or a lateral move to go to a different agency or department, that's going to be on your record. So you don't want to play with that in terms of violating the Hatch Act. But a lot of it has been relaxed in terms of, can they participate in campaigns? Yes, outside the office, not during work hours, not in their official capacities. They can participate in political activities. I have worked on campaigns with many federal bureaucracy civil service employees that have not done it in their official capacity, but have passed out campaign flyers and called from a campaign office or that sort of thing to voters and that sort of thing. That is not in violation of the Hatch Act, as long as they're not doing it in an official capacity in that respect. So there are ways they can get around it today, and again, it has been much more relaxed since the bill was passed in 1939. So true or false? Can the head of agencies be easily fire the bureaucrats in their agency? They can't. It's really hard to fire someone because of the civil service protections that they have there. Now, it is a process. Can they do it? Yes. Can they do it easily? No. It is a long process. It does take a while, and they have been able to do it. But it does give the bureaucracy a bad name in that it is hard to fire those employees. And that really is the driver that really causes a lot of bad press in the media for the bureaucracy, drain the swamp. We've seen all sorts of things like that. And the reason behind that is obviously because of the structure that's in place to protect them from political machinations, to protect them from any political fallout, because they are civil service employees, and that idea of continuity of government. Okay, so that takes us to a chart we looked at earlier, which was this idea of, so how does this policy-making or rule-making process actually play out? Well, it is not just the agency that does this, but it is state and local governments that carry this out. So the feds are really reliant on employees working in their state government offices as well as local government offices to help implement this. If it's giving money to states or giving money to people, it's how does that filter down into the states and into the local governments and gets to the American taxpayer to be able to help those people, especially now, right, during coronavirus. How do you filter that down in a way that it really reaches the people who need it the most? It's state and local governments that are going to help with that too. So a lot of the programs and that are being implemented are through state and local governments as well, in terms of grants and grant making and low interest loans or no interest loans. All of that's carried out through state and local government. Now, it is a process. When any time legislation is passed, it is a process in terms of trying to create final rules, proposed rules, and then final rules. There are comment periods in which they hold comments for people to be able to weigh in on them from the general public, as well as from Congress, as well as from interest groups and special interests and others within the bureaucracy to weigh in terms of how it might impact them. It is a process, and getting the Pfizer vaccine to approval stage, which is what's happening this week, is a great example of this process that they have really tried to speed up because people are dying every day. We had 3,000 people, a record 3,000 people die yesterday of coronavirus, of COVID-19. And so you can see the urgency in moving through this process quickly. President Trump has said this. We're trying to fast track it because people are dying and trying to address that. But it is a process, and there are procedures to follow, and trying to move more quickly through that is really where the SES, the Senior Executive Service, and members of the civil service within those agencies are helping to make that happen. Now, there's a lot of things that can slow this down, and that leads to what will be our next one, but we can also see here that there's some legislation along the way that bureaucrats have to follow, that the civil service has to follow here in terms of making sure that they are abiding by or following the letter of the law. The Administrative Procedures Act is one of those. The idea of how agencies propose and establish regulations. It really governs how they go about their proposed rulemaking process, how they go about carrying out these laws into rules and having comment periods and ways for the public to weigh in, and then come out with the final rules and regulations and how they're enforced. Administrative Procedure Act really guides them in terms of creating those procedures for how they're going to do that. And then making sure that this is a public process. So the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, is the idea that this can't be done in a dark room, closed doors, sealed off from the public. It's got to be known. Sunshine laws relate to this. The idea that and this goes to the bottom here, the open meeting law. You can't hold these meetings in private. You can't hold these behind closed doors. You can't do these meetings quickly or without the public being notified or informed that these meetings are taking place. That's what gives the bureaucracy and the government a bad name in terms of looking like it's corrupt, looking like they're trying to do something underhanded and they can't maintain control of it. So a lot of that is impacting the bureaucracy in terms of how they carry out their job as well. And the other regulations we see here, the National Environmental Policy, there's always some type of environmental standard that needs to be set. And when you're looking at highways, for instance, what's the environmental impact? And how do we look at that first in terms of what we're even going to do in terms of changing this road or highway or implementing a new metro? All of these environmental impact standards have an impact there, as well as privacy. How do we maintain data for people that we're helping to make sure that their records aren't open to hackers, or making sure that the records are secure, as well as making sure that even within the agency, people who have access to them is limited in nature in terms of trying to help them, but not gain access to information you don't need. So the bureaucracy is very limited in terms of how it can carry those types of things out. And it is constraining on the bureaucracy because following all those procedures does tend to slow them down. We do see some slowing of those efforts in terms of either creating additional pathologies or ways to hamper their efforts that keep them from doing their best work. And that's what we get to in the next one here. But the idea, the effect is it's going to keep government from being able to implement anything quickly. Now we've seen with the Pfizer vaccine, for example, we've seen them move at record pace. I mean, chickenpox, to develop a vaccine and get it approved for people to use took, I think, almost 30 years in terms of developing that vaccine and then testing it and approving it. This is record time in that they've been under development for less than a year, and to be able to gain approval this week is really incredible in terms of really fast tracking the process. And obviously a pandemic would yield or necessitate that process. So let's talk about what's going to slow those processes down. And that really is our number 2 of the highlights here. These are the pathologies, the idea of how does the waste, fraud, and abuse, the problems within the bureaucracy, what we hear most about. How does this get in the way of letting the bureaucracy do its job to help the American people? Well, red tape is a big one, right? So lots of rules, lots of procedures, paperwork. The Administrative Procedures Act I mentioned as an example, in terms of having to do lots of things and do them by the book and follow the procedures. Did you follow the procedures? That's a red tape scenario. That tends to keep government from implementing policy that's helping the American people. We also have conflict. Sometimes we have agencies saying they're going to do one thing and the other agency is going to do something else that counteracts or conflicts with what they have going on. That doesn't help anybody. And again, that keeps people from getting the resources they need. Hurricane Katrina was a good example of this. We had so much confusion and conflict among the agencies in terms of who was doing what, when, where, that supplies weren't getting to the people who needed it the most. That is not what the bureaucracy is designed to do. It is designed to help people, not hurt people. And so conflict is a pathology that gets in the way. Duplication. Sometimes we are required to fill out more than one form and they all look the same, but they're for different agencies or for different reasons that this paperwork or this process needs to be followed. Duplication can slow things down and again keep help from getting to the American people. Imperialism. Well, our agency is more important than yours, so leave us alone. We need to hire more people. We need more money. We need more budget here. The imperialistic approach. The me first mentality of imperialism that we see in the bureaucracy sometimes gets in the way of doing what's needed for the American people in terms of trying to fast track or carry out the will of the people and in helping the American people. And we see a lot of this. We've seen a lot of this over the years. Department of Agriculture was one example, when especially in the early 1900s, when agriculture was really big and we were a much more agrarian society, but moving to a more industrialized approach, what we saw was farmers really needed help. And how were they getting it? Well, they weren't. And so the Department of Agriculture was growing in order to help those farmers. Ultimately, we would end up with a Department of Agriculture at their peak that had 3 employees for every farmer that was out there. It was crazy. And then Congress stepped in and said, whoa, what is going on? This is a pathology that is combining with some of the other pathologies we see here, and it's not helping farmers. It's not helping get the money to the American farmer that really needs it. So that's imperialism in nature. And then we have waste. We've all heard about the $600 toilet seat or the $400 hammer. They spent $1 million studying wind. Lots of things that many times we look at and go, why on earth was there a rider or some particular type of the old earmark system that is here? And it's because it's a pathology. It's a favor that's done in order to get a vote in Congress, and now the bureaucracy has to live with it, has to carry it out. So many times it's not the bureaucracy at all that included that. It's Congress that passed it in order to get somebody's vote on the bill. And so what does that do? Well, the bureaucracy still has to carry it out. They still have to do the work that's in the law. And so then they get the bad rap because they're spending $600 on a toilet seat or $800,000 on an outhouse in a park somewhere. And it was called for in the bill that was made into a law by Congress in order to get somebody's vote. So we see a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse, corruption that really gives bureaucracy a bad name. Really lends itself to what President Trump tied into in the 2016 election, this idea of drain the swamp, because it is not a cheap process to carry out these rules, not just to enforce them, but also to regulate them, to write them, to go through that whole policy making and rule making process and opening it up to the American people. But that's what we don't see behind the scenes is all of that work that's being done. What we do see in the media is things like this: assistant to the aide of the deputy vice chairman of the committee to reduce Pentagon bureaucracy, right? We see, here's a Dilbert. I started a task force to eliminate redundancies in our internal processes. Really, I'm doing the same thing. Oh my goodness, are you kidding? And so we see this over and over again, this idea of waste, fraud, and abuse of the pathologies that are at work here, and it lends itself to the idea of drain the swamp, the idea of we need to do something because the whole thing's flawed. But remember, there's 4.5 million people doing a lot of great work for the American people behind the scenes that doesn't get covered in the media, and 7.5 million contractors that are doing the work of the American people that also doesn't get covered in that mess. So as we know, it's usually the bad things that come to light. We see this with Congress. We see this with the White House. We see this with the bureaucracy. And that leads us to our final highlight in this chapter, and that is what powers do we see the president and Congress have over the bureaucracy. And again, I'm not going to go into a lot of details here in terms of the checks and balances. You can do that, but we can see the president sets the agenda. The president is the head of the bureaucracy. So the president has a lot of power here in terms of what he can do in order to make sure that they are following the policy agenda of the administration. Congress also has significant authority here in terms of carrying out the will of the people and making sure that the bureaucracy is doing what they gave them money to do, and lots of programs that we talked about earlier in terms of doing it. Here's a case that I'm not going to go into detail here, but I'm just mentioning it. Excuse me, I mention it here because I think this is a case we're going to hear a lot about in upcoming court cases. This is the Chevron case. When Neil Gorsuch was actually before the Senate Judiciary Committee for his nomination to the court, he mentioned Chevron quite a bit. He was asked about it quite a bit, as was Kavanaugh, as was Amy Coney Barrett. And this case is important because this case established the idea of interpretation and of agency interpretation. Does the bureaucracy, the agency, have the right to interpret what the law was meant to do by Congress and passed and signed into law by the president? Does the agency have the ability, the power, under the rulemaking process to interpret that law, which is something that the courts usually do, right? But they're doing it in terms of how to carry the bill out. And in this case, the Supreme Court said, yes, we defer to the agency that they have the right to interpret that legislation in terms of carrying it out. But it has to pass a test, and they go into more detail here, which I'm not going to go into. But the idea here was they established this idea of the bureaucracy basically giving them a long leash and saying, you have the right to interpret, but we're going to rule it unconstitutional if you do something that steps out of line. And so for 36 years, we've essentially went by that Chevron standard. Now, that may be changing. We'll see if the court continues to agree with precedent there in the Chevron case. But keep your eye on it, because I think the court's going to be taking a look at this case or something related to this case in terms of agency interpretation. Are we giving the bureaucracy too much power by allowing them to interpret to the point that the court is basically stepping back and letting them run with it, and then stepping in if something's unconstitutional and it ends up being a lawsuit in which someone has standing to sue on it. So stay tuned. We'll see what happens there. But that is an important aspect that we will probably see more of in due time. Now, the 9/11 Commission report is a great example of taking a report. Congress establishes the Department of Homeland Security, and then a new cabinet position, a new department is actually created out of a bunch of agencies in order to help streamline intelligence on behalf of the president. That was a major change in our lifetime in terms of trying to change the bureaucracy and do it for purposes of national security. So I mentioned it here as implementation because this is a great example of where Congress stepped in, appointed a commission, stepped in and looked at a situation and said, yeah, the president is right. President Bush proposed that we have a Department of Homeland Security. The 9/11 Commission reiterates this point. And as a result, we're going to change the laws such that we're going to streamline this so that we have better intelligence around national security. And what we see as the Department of Homeland Security today is a result of that very act, of that very report put together by that commission. Okay, so I've got a couple of bonuses here for you. And again, we're just going to hit the highlights in terms of what's happening here. So does the federal bureaucracy really work? Well, we can kind of see, we've kind of outlined that in terms of it depends on what situation you're taking. But if that's an argumentative essay, you could probably argue either way. You could argue with it, yes, it does work in some cases. No, it doesn't work in pathologies and some of those cases that we've talked about today, but be able to defend it in terms of some good examples that we have looked at under the Trump administration, under the Obama administration, under the Bush administration, to help you carry that out. Legislative veto, this is no longer. It was ruled unconstitutional in 1983. But for about 50 years, Congress had the power to basically give the executive agency the power to basically, looking at this, giving the president the power to veto something that the agency was going to do, particular actions and whatnot. And the idea was the president or the agency could essentially say, no, we're going to take a vote on that, and by majority, we're not going to do it. This usurped the power of what the Congress was meant to do in terms of giving the agency the law, and then they were to implement the law. They were to carry that out. And the president was supposed to enforce that law. And how they went about doing it was essentially passed down from the president and the policy agenda. There was thought that this could serve as more of a legislative check in terms of what Congress was doing here. And the Supreme Court stepped in and said, no, it's too much legislative power in the executive branch. So they ruled it unconstitutional. And that's that is a case, INS v. Chadha, in which the court overturned that and said, no, this isn't something that we're going to give the president the power to do. Now, fast forward, we had Clinton v. City of New York, in which the president over time also asked for the line item veto, which was the power to veto particular aspects of bills, and the court came back in Clinton v. City of New York and ruled that unconstitutional as well. So the court is really looking at the legislative branch to do the lawmaking, not the executive branch, and these two cases are two good examples of where the court has stepped in and said, no, you're the executive branch, enforce the laws, don't try and make the laws, that's the job of Congress. Now, in terms of accountability to the bureaucracy, we mentioned this before, but again, Congress can do a lot, the president can do things too, and the courts have stepped in to determine constitutionality of those. But again, pause here if you want to read through those. I went over those in the overview, but hopefully you'll find that helpful. Okay, and the last thing I want to mention is just how well do you know your U.S. government bureaucracy? I started with this in the overview videos, and I hope you'll come back to this. If you can't answer questions, hopefully you'll go back into the reading, go back into the overview videos, or into the highlights to help answer these questions. But you should be able to answer most, if not all of these after we're done here with the highlights video. And guess what? We are done. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to the next chapter. We're looking at the judiciary, and that overview video will be coming to you very soon. So good luck on the upcoming assessment, and we will see you in the judiciary.